Hello guys and girls and horror fans of all ages. I am Bored Now, or Keith to my friends, and on this video I will have a review of It Chapter 2, the second part of the film adaptation of Stephen King's best-selling novel, which was released in cinemas on Friday and which I went to see at my local cinema today. So I'm pretty fresh off it, seeing it earlier, and I'm going to get into it in just a few moments. So thank you for watching this review. So I'll set up a bit of background on it and my feelings on it, and see what I did there already. That didn't take long. So obviously, after the initial book, which is a massive novel, it's 1,000 pages, but was a big bestseller, as I said, for King. Then you had the 1990 miniseries. Now, the miniseries, which obviously you had Tim Curry in the role of the iconic scary clown, Pennywise. The miniseries was one of those I just had fond memories of as a kid. Probably one of the first bits of telly which really captured my imagination. I really remember getting sucked into it. But I have to say, I rewatched it quite recently. It was on one of the Sky channels, and yeah, it didn't do much for me. It's really aged badly. It's very melodramatic and soapy. I thought the plot was kind of a mess, and yeah, it's one of those. It is sort of a product of its time. It's quite typical of what you got in particularly the early 90s, but it's very network TV before you really started getting the ambitious kind of cutting edge type shows. But of course, people remember it for Tim Curry's performance as the scary clown Pennywise. And that is the thing that stands out when you rewatch it. He is fantastic. I think of Tim Curry as this very solid kind of comedic actor. He's always very watchable in any role, but obviously there's a couple of roles that people really remember him for. One is, the role in Rocky Horror Picture Show, and the other one is clearly Pennywise. That really changed the game for kind of scary clowns on TV and film. So thinking of obviously the big screen version now, these two movies, and obviously Bill Skarsgard takes over from Tim Curry. So big shoes to fill, and obviously without giving anything away for what I thought of the latest film. I think Skarsgård does a decent job in the role. I think he's quite creepy, and I think he does do something a bit different with the part. I think there are particularly, in both films actually, without spoiling my thoughts, but I think at times he does overact and he's a little bit too hammy. But then that might partly just be the direction and what the script was sort of asking him to do. But I think he's perfectly decent as Pennywise. It was always going to be hard to follow Tim Curry. So probably if there's one thing you would say the TV version, the miniseries, has over the films is that Curry is the defining Pennywise, I'm sure, for many, and Skarsgård gives it a decent bash and is perfectly fine, but I don't think he was ever gonna live up to Curry's performance in the miniseries. So getting on to my thoughts on the first film before I get on to this second part. I mean, I've not read the book, so I can't really comment on that. Well, comparing it to that, but the first film, it was a real surprise. I mean, I didn't know if I was going to like it or not. Obviously, I mean, that was before I'd rewatched the miniseries, so I kind of Yeah, I didn't have much to go on. I just remembered liking the miniseries from my youth. Um, but it was a real surprise. I mean, it did sort of tap into some of what Stranger Things has managed to do on Netflix. And I mean, as a horror movie, it's maybe not great. I think the horror elements are the weakest of the film. Still talking about It Chapter 1 here. But what it did is, like something like Stranger Things, it just gave you really, really interesting and likable and complex sort of children character sort of thing. And it really invested you in those characters. So when the horror elements did come up, you cared about what happened to them. It was really nicely cast, good sort of character arc over the sort of the film. And these characters do go from one place and change over the course of the film. So it was a classic coming of age sort of film in that way. I think the small town setting was really well captured. And it had themes in it. I think it did work in some political themes of the era. And I mean, that's one of the things I like about Stranger Things. I like not just is it this spectacular, drama show with really good jokes, really good characters, but it also moves with the times, and it's quite meaty in the way it has these kind of themes of the era. And I think it did that quite well as well. It's not a perfect film, but I thought it was quite well directed. And I just got into the characters, I followed them through, and I cared about what happened to them. Now, moving on to It Chapter 2. Now, the mini-series, just to go back to that for a second, it had this odd sort of structure where I guess it might have been because they had to find a way to cram as much of the book in as possible, but obviously, had to find a structure for it that they felt would work as a mini-series on TV. So they did this odd thing where actually from the start they were flashing back and forth between the adults and the kids. So unlike the film, the first where it was all the kids in that film, and now in the second half it's going to be the second film. It's going to be the adults with some flashbacks. Yeah, in the mini-series they decided to flash back and forth between the two, and they did that sort of from the start, and yeah, that's another thing that really didn't work for me. So in this, it's basically the adult story, although they do flash back to their time as kids and as part of the Losers Club. So the story, basically, in case you don't know, is that they've all moved on, and it moves forward 27 years, and most of them, barring one, I think the Mike character, have all moved away and all have lives elsewhere. So that's an interesting detail, the fact that Mike is kind of the one stuck in the original town. Kind of maybe he's the one who hasn't moved on so much, although the past still haunts the others. I think they have sort of got on with their lives in a way he maybe hasn't. But then Mike sort of calls them back. He contacts all of them, and because essentially the presence of Pennywise has been felt again in the town, and he's starting to make his mark again and starting to murder people. And as he contacts each one, something happens to them. They get a sense, they get a feeling, or something even worse happens. And so Pennywise is sort of with them, so he coerces them into coming back, says, you have to come back, this is important. And then it's slowly revealed then this is why, because Pennywise is back. And it's based on a pact they made when they were kids, so from the first film. they agreed then if Pennywise ever returned, then they would return to face him, so to speak. And what they realise over the course of the film is that he'll come back every 27 years, but the catch is, if they don't stop him this time, then they can't move on, and they'll essentially be killed, sort of thing. So yeah, they find out then they have to stop him somehow, and they try various ways throughout the film, and you see you don't get the gang. They're not so much a group in this film as the kids were in the first film. So you get various scenes with each one and Pennywise and him playing on their fears. And so it's that kind of thing about having to overcome the past and face up to your fears, sort of thing. And I mean, I'm going to sort of go into some details. So this will be the period where I mention any spoilers if you've not seen the film and want to turn off the video now and return later. But yeah, going to mention a few spoilers from now on. So yeah, one of them kills himself. He hears of the news. He's sort of called back, and he kills himself in the bathtub. And it's kind of the fact that he can't deal with it, or at least that's the impression. I mean, later on it sort of comes out. Then there's a bit more to it than that. Then he sort of he says to them, he writes them all a letter, and Stanley, his name is. I was trying to remember the character's name. So he basically slits his wrists in the bathtub. And he sort of says to the group in a letter later on in the film, he says that the real reason he did it was because he just knew. Well, he knew he couldn't face it, but he also says then he knew then really for them to defeat Pennywise, they had to be committed as a group and they had to all be prepared. And because he knew he wasn't prepared, then he didn't want to get in their way, sort of thing. He didn't want to be the odd one out, and he didn't want to ruin their chances, so he took himself out of the picture. I mean, that's how he phrases it, so it's almost all or nothing. So he is killed, sort of thing. And I mean, the Jessica Chastain character, because this dates back to the first film, she can actually see each one's sort of death, so she kind of knows about Stanley before any of them. So, I mean, getting on to what I thought about it, obviously Andy Muschietti, I've done that before, Muschietti. Oh dear. Muschietti, I'll go with Muschietti. He directs it once again, and this time the script is by Gary Doberman, who has a bit of a horror history. He's done the script for the Annabelle movies, or at least had hands in them. So I'll get on to the writing in a bit. And you've got a pretty decent cast there. I think they've cast it well with the adults. Jessica Chastain, who I really like. James McAvoy is very good. And he's kind of the Stephen King type character in a way. His character, because he's gone on to become this writer, but he writes he writes novels, but I mean, they're sort of adapted into like Hollywood type things. But there's an in-joke sort of thing where his character, his novels are known for being, generally good, but he never knows how to end a novel, which of course is probably one of the hardest things when you're writing a novel. But yeah, that's a criticism which has been labelled at King. So that's almost like an in-joke. And there's even a scene where King has a cameo and they sort of meet each other. So, yeah, this was a real disappointment after I really enjoyed the first film. There's a number of reasons. I mean, basically, it is a mess of a film. The script is just really poor. It has none of the continuity of the first film, where you were told, a clear story, where you could really engage with the characters, and where it had a perfect, well, certainly a really tight structure throughout. And this just feels like a whole like sort of jukebox of hits, a whole like roller coaster almost. And it's just too much. I mean, it's just very full on. You get one after the other. There's very little time to breathe. And I mean, hardly any of them really connect or have any sort of impact. It's very CGI heavy. They overdo it with the CGI. And yeah, it's sort of one after the other, so it means very little and it becomes very predictable, because what happens throughout the film is when the characters come up against Pennywise, is that he'll trick each one, sort of thing. So there'll either be like a memory of when they were young, or something like that, and then Pennywise will turn out to be the other person, so he transforms into Pennywise, and so he gets to them that way. But I mean, because you're getting these kind of close together, I think it gets to the stage where it is kind of predictable that that's going to happen. I mean, the problem when you line up like these sort of set pieces is then after a while it's just telegraphed and this is going to be the next sort of set piece. Whereas if you space them out, if there was more story in between, you wouldn't have such a problem. And I think this is kind of the movie equivalent of just paying too much lip service to the author, to Stephen King, because it's ridiculously long. It's 169 minutes. So I mean, close to 3 hours is just too long. I know, I remember the first film being quite long, but it wasn't this long, and I never really felt the length with that one. With this, you definitely do. It's overkill. It's very baggy, and it just feels like, it feels like they couldn't say no. They couldn't say, well, that was the novel and this is the film, and we're going to have to be disciplined and edit. I mean, obviously it could have been even longer potentially, but it's obviously too long as it is. And yeah, it does feel like there's too much lip service paid to, the kind of icon Stephen King. Obviously as a cameo, but there's a lot of stuff happening in here, like where it's referencing his other novels. I mean, there's a Shining reference thrown in at one point, which doesn't need to be there. There's references thrown to other films like Die Hard at one point, and it's like, what the hell? It just feels out of place. It really hits you in the face with these big, grandiose set pieces, because don't forget, the first film, although it did have moments like that, it was very low key throughout, and as I said, it was more about the characters. Now it feels like the characters are like a side sort of thought, and it's being driven by the carnival, by the big grandiose set pieces. Another issue I had was then there's a lot of comedy, and some of it is funny. I mean, it's not that it's not funny, it's just then it feels out of place. It feels like it's thrown in at moments where it should be a horror moment, where it should be a dramatic moment. So they overdid the comedy. I mean, you have Bill Hader as one of the cast who's obviously from a comedy background, and he's very good in the film. I can't really pick much of a fault with any of the cast. And he does make that character funny and kind of likable, but yeah, it's just some of his stuff. It's just too much. It's at these inconvenient moments where it should be a more dramatic, a more horror, a more scary sort of scene, and then suddenly, yeah, it's just OTT. I mean, I mentioned the Die Hard reference. I mean, that comes at a point where yeah, it should be more focused. It should be something a bit more sinister. So the comedy bits of it work. I mean, when they're out in a group and there's not that much, when you're just building up the characters, that's sort of fine because that's in like a social thing, and there's other times when it works, but I just thought it was used too often. Whereas if you think about something like the recent Halloween film, I mean, I know that was criticised for some of the comedy, but I, for one, thought the comedy in that worked quite well and that it didn't feel jarring. But in this, I did think it was overdone and did feel jarring. So that's another issue. I mean, the cast are probably the strongest thing. They all do their best with not great material. I mean, it's the writing mostly just isn't very good. But the cast are very strong, and there's some great moments. There's still good moments in the film, even though I'm not a big fan of this film. So, you know, the cast really do their best, I have to say. And the ending actually was very touching. I like the way it tied it all up at the end. And I guess in a way, the very end got back to what appealed about the first film, and that was this bond between the group and the whole coming of age. And then, yeah, there's just something very touching about their dynamic and their relationships and the way they support each other. It's a touching sort of friendship that they sort of have, and this group sort of bond, because obviously this film loses some of the group dynamic of the first film. I mean, in the last film, you had a lot of them as a group, and that drove things on, whereas in this you get a lot of individual scenes, and I don't think it works as well. And I mean, that's another thing that adds to the length, because you've got to have all these, in a way they feel like segments or skits with them and Pennywise and what have you. And yeah, the whole thing is just very over the top and really in your face, and it's hard to work out really why they took it in this direction particularly. I mean, apart from maybe they thought they had to do something to top the first film, but considering the first film was such a massive hit, then in a way you'd think there was no pressure to really do anything that different. But yeah, I think one of the big problems is that I just didn't care about the characters as much as in It Chapter 1. And I think the problem with that is the fact that It Chapter 1, it took time getting to know them. As I said before, there's sort of an arc over the course of the film, and you really feel this camaraderie between them, and they really grow as characters, so you do have good character depth. In this, you don't have that, because it's this sort of this idea where they're suddenly thrown back into each other's lives after a long time. And you see them starting to bond and go over old stuff, but you don't really have the same sort of character arc, and they're sort of thrown into the whole situation. So yeah, you don't although it's a lot even longer film, you don't really have that sort of them growing together as characters, because obviously it's playing on then there's already this past between them, and that's what's brought them back. So I think that is another weakness. As good as the cast are, I just never really cared about the characters. Certainly not as much as in the original film. And there are some flashbacks they work in, and some of those I think work better than others. I think some of them maybe could have been cut. I think at times it is a very dark film. I mean, the opening is certainly very dark. And I mean, that's interesting because in a way the rest of the film doesn't really follow that sort of tone. But you essentially have one of the characters is with his boyfriend, and they're sort of harassed by this group of bullies. And this is kind of the start of the film, and the bullies end up, pursuing them and beating them up, and they throw, his boyfriend in the river, and that's when we see Pennywise for the first time in this film, and he essentially, kills him. So it's a very dark opening to the film, and there are moments like that. It's quite a graphic film, and it's obviously bringing up issues of the time. But yeah, that scene does feel quite standalone, that opening scene. And overall, although there's more horror elements, they're just not very scary, they're just not very interesting. Whereas in the first film, Pennywise was used more sparingly. I think in this, he's just overdone, there's too much of him. And as I said, it's just very bombastic and in your face. And it's draining. It is way too long. I mean, it would be, because I've not read the novel. I've read a couple of King novels. I've read Carrie, his first one, and Misery, both of which I really like. So I'm going to read more of his. And I mean, I might make a point of reading it next. But yeah, it'll be interesting reading, the book of this, because it makes me wonder if some of the plot issues in this second film are just maybe inherent in the book, or if it's just something where the book, obviously you can take more time, you can space things out, you can explain them, and maybe it's just then they've just overdone it in this film. But it's depressing because I really enjoyed the first film, but it's a shambles of a film, and it really lacks the charm of the first film. It does have its moments. I'm not going to say this is a totally terrible film, but it's a crushing disappointment, and yeah, really disappointing after enjoying the first one. I mean, I'd say then it chapter 1, if you may be looking for a defining version of it, on the screen, big or small, then the first It film is that. Stumbling over my words again. But It chapter 2, I do not recommend. It was very disappointing. And I guess the only thing left to do is to rate it, and I will rate it a 4 out of 10. So it's not completely terrible, but below average, really poor stuff. So that's It chapter 2. It's on general release now. If you've already seen the film, then please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and please, if you liked it, let me know why you liked it, why you disagree with me. I'm hoping for a discussion. Now, just looking ahead to my next horror movie review, obviously there's going to be a whole bunch in October, but my next one should be Ready or Not, which I know is coming out in the next week or two. So I won't guarantee it, but I think that will probably be my next horror review on this channel. So yeah, that could be quite interesting as well. But for now, thank you for listening, and like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks guys, see you soon.